Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Whether you are a sales professional, not in sales, but interested in helping people solve problems, or you're a founder, CEO who's looking to grow your business, you'll find practical tools, stories, and experience you can apply to your role. This is Mike Simmons. I'm the founder of Catalyst Sale. I'm excited to have Luke Thomas, co-founder of Friday and former colleague on the podcast this week. We discuss remote work, teams, technology, communication, and a number of other interesting topics. Hey, Luke, thanks for joining the podcast. It's great to reconnect.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, so you've got some exciting things that have happened recently. You have officially launched your business where you're doing this full time. Can you share with the audience a little bit about what you're doing today and why you're doing it?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the co-founder of this company called Friday. And the reason why the software exists is because high-performing individuals, teams, and companies all have really successful habits. And we think that software can help aid in that habit creation process and help you be more effective at work. So specifically, as an individual, a lot of high performers have daily routines, daily rituals. It may involve reflection, kind of thinking about what you're working on for the day. It could be, just prioritizing better. For a team, it could be doing things like, if I'm a manager, I'm holding regular one-on-ones with my team. We have effective, status updates or effective weekly meetings, making sure that the information is flowing where it needs to be. Then if I'm an executive, there are also habits that are important, making sure that communication flows. So one example I'll give, you and I both used to work at O'Reilly or Safari Books Online at the time. And Andrew, the CEO, did a really great job doing, I believe they were monthly updates, where he would share a high-level update about the business and would then pause and answer questions. I would argue that's an example of a successful communication habit. And so Friday, the software exists to enable more of that, taking the best practices of high-performing teams and just making it easier through software.
So we've got access to different tools like Slack and Teams and Yammer and Jive and Trello and Asana, and there are all these different tools that are out there. Why do we need another one?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would argue that there's kind of a difference between collaboration and communication. So the type of communication or the type of activity that happens in Slack is typically it revolves around a project. And so what ends up happening is I'll get, a ping from a coworker and I need to jump in, and it's kind of implied that I need to get right back to them. The same, I would argue, is also true in all these project management tools like a Trello, Asana, or Jira, where it's just very tactical work and very tactical conversations related to the work. So the reason, or where kind of Friday fits into this, is that I view it as there's this need to abstract all the noise and all the day-to-day work and deliver kind of insights in a very short and sweet manner. So I would, if you think about the habits at work, they already kind of exist. So a weekly staff meeting, for example, is a summarization of the tactical day-to-day work that's happening in the upcoming week or that happened in the past week. Another example is that, monthly update that I shared. That is an example of kind of this abstraction on top of the day-to-day. And so I think that there's a need for that because people are, still filling out status updates. They're still trying to get a sense of what's going on. And they, if I were to jump into Jira or Slack or Asana, it's going to be so tactical that it ends up becoming just really noisy. And so we're trying to separate the signal from the noise.
Awesome. And, it's interesting as you talk through it. I mean, many of these are just challenges we have struggled with as human beings, or in some instances have done really well as human beings over time, whether it's leveraging story as a way to communicate or pictures as a way to communicate or engagement that we have. And you start talking about these networks that exist, yet inside businesses, we still struggle with communication. And why is it that we struggle with communication?
Well, I think as humans, we kind of have flaws, right? So for me, I can, as you probably have already can tell, and the listener can tell, I kind of bounce around a lot. Another thing is I will quickly forget things. And so the reality from my perspective, is that, if you think about 100 years ago, the bottlenecks were the machines. And now I believe, and the company really is kind of based around the premise that in a knowledge work economy, humans are the bottleneck now. We forget things. We aren't effective communicators sometimes. We can ramble. We can maybe not be emotional enough when we need to be. When all the work is, or a major piece of the work is being done in someone's head, it creates more and more of a dependency on the humans doing the work. And so there's kind of these flaws in how we communicate, but there are ways that we can become more effective in our communication. And so Friday really tries to bring that to the surface so that you can become a better communicator if you're using it for a team, for example. So if you want, I can give examples.
Yeah, well, let's get into examples in just a second. I think the one that jumps out for me though is, and I know that you and I are pretty active on Twitter. That seems to be where a lot of our engagement is these days. You will periodically post pictures of books that you're reading, and you'll post an image or a picture of a page from maybe something that Drucker wrote 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how those same concepts apply today, and that things haven't, although the technology has changed significantly, the needs and the communication and the fundamentals have not. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So I guess I should very quickly go over why I read older books. I think it's Jeff Bezos who, I don't know if it's in one of his shareholder letters or in a conversation he had. He made a really interesting case and said, essentially what you should be paying attention to is the things that don't change. And the vast majority of kind of newer management books that I've read they just feel very lacking.
Yep.
There's a good one every now and then. And the way I think about it is that, if you read books that have been around and are timeless, it's highly likely that those are principles that will not change in the next, 100 years, 50 years, et cetera. I think Nassim Taleb in one of his books calls it the Lindy effect, which is essentially if a book has been around for 500 years, it's highly likely that it will be around for another 500 years. And so I think that's why I read the older books, is to understand what those principles are that will probably not change in the next 100 years or so. To get back to your original question, which I'm trying to remember, is why things haven't changed, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was more about why things haven't changed and how, and even just drawing the correlation between how Drucker has hit the mark, and how much value there is in reading through and studying the past.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, part of the reason why things really haven't changed is because you're dealing with people, right? The things that he documented are people issues or people opportunities, however you want to call it. And humans, from my perspective, not too much has changed about human nature in the last 50 years. And so theoretically, the principles should be very similar. As you mentioned, technology has changed and it's enabled certain things. I can communicate with an old coworker very easily after this call. But with that, it also clearly presents challenges as well. So, yeah, I wish I had more to say about this, but I just think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the past. And if we are paying attention and don't get caught up by the shiny toys, then I think, there's opportunities to build really interesting things that tap into things that will be true in the future.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the habits that we create. And you started this talking about the habits that we have as an organization and the habits that we have as individuals. And then you can even go a little bit further and say we have habits inside our family dynamic. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are things that change those habits. Like you have a son in the house now. So that would have changed habits that you had previously. How do we build these habits and what informs those habits, both at an individual and organization level? And I'd like to take that part of the conversation down a path where we talk about changing those habits.
Yeah, sure. So, there's all kinds of books out there on habit creation. My favorite framework is relatively simple to remember. And it is based on, I believe, a Stanford researcher called B.J. Fogg. He's really kind of popular in the tech space because I believe in the early 2000s, he wrote a book on, habit change and how technology relates to it. Mm-hmm. But he has kind of a 3-part framework, which should be easy to remember. It's essentially it needs three components to converge approximately at the same time. First, you need motivation. So you need a higher level of motivation to be able to change a habit or to start a habit. The second is you need the ability, right? You need to be able to do the thing.
Yep.
And then finally, T, you need the trigger. So it's MAT, M-A-T. The trigger is there needs to be something that essentially reminds you to perform the habit. And what BJ Fogg kind of talks about, which I found a helpful example, is, maybe you're brushing your teeth, and right after you brush your teeth, you decide that you should do push-ups, for example. So the trigger is brushing your teeth. And so I found that's the simplest way to kind of think about habit change. And other people have different ones, but that's the one that works for me. And like, big disclaimer here, I am generally not good at changing my behavior or establishing habits. And so to some extent, I'm trying to build a tool to help myself.
Yep.
And so to expand that to work, I would argue, you still need those components, but where Friday focuses a lot of attention is around the trigger. So there's a lot of coworkers, or sometimes I'll do it. I'll set a calendar reminder to do a thing. And so at a previous company I worked at, there was a calendar reminder to submit a status update. And maybe there was a calendar reminder to, fill out a Google Doc or something. Where Friday really kind of hangs out is around that trigger. And so what you could do with the tool is you could say, okay, every week on a Tuesday at 9 a.m., prompt these specific people for an update. And then based on the responses, push it to a specific channel of your choosing. And the channel could be email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, or something else. But the whole idea is that there's a trigger, right? And ideally that trigger is delivered in your workflow. So if it's time to fill out a status update, for example, you might get a DM over Slack.
Yep.
Right? Or you might get an email, but people, email is a little tricky because sometimes people have thousands of emails that they haven't read.
Yep. Emails where things go to die in my book.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea is that with that trigger that can be rolled out to a group or to the entire company or just one or two people, that dramatically improves or increases the probability that people will do a certain thing.
Yeah. And
so you have to, if I were to have to go out and create a calendar reminder for my team, then there's kind of this, there's actually a decent amount of work that you need to do that. It sounds crazy, but that work is a barrier to doing the thing. And
Sure.
So how do you make that really, really easy? How do you increase the ability, right? The A in the MAT framework.
Yep.
So, yeah, we're just really kind of building software around a relatively simple framework, I suppose.
Well, and that's
we can't really fully solve the motivation thing. But
Sure.
But that's something where if you're a leader and you want to roll out or kickstart a habit with your team, that's where you need to provide the reasons for why it's important. And there ideally is some personal benefit to everyone on your team by doing the certain thing.
Well, and when you go through the hiring process, ideally what you're doing is you're hiring people with a certain level of passion around solving the problem that your organization solves, or solving the problem that you need to solve within your organization, whatever that is. But you ideally hire people who have a certain level of passion. Then do they have an attitude that allows them to execute or deal with conflict or handle situations where things don't work out the right way? Do they have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control? And Carol Quinn was on the podcast a number of episodes back where she talks about the motivation-based interview process, MBI. And this gets into passion, it gets into attitude, and then you get into skills. And those skills can be taught. Now, there are some innate skills that we have, things that we're really good at, and there's some that we can work to get better at. But to get back to the habit piece, what's interesting is you talk about BJ Fogg's work, and then you even go back into, I forget which professor it was that I had back in the 90s when I was at ASU, but you talk about click whir, and there's this click that happens, and there's this whir that takes place. There are these if this then that type protocols, and as we start breaking this apart and thinking about designing solutions to address a given problem, you can start to separate each of the things that you want to have happen and then have those triggers that help be a catalyst, so to speak, to get those things to happen. For me, one of my triggers is I have a whiteboard that is prominent in my office. I have another whiteboard that is right by the door when I walk out of the office. And I have another whiteboard that's in the area where I work out in the house. And those whiteboards serve different purposes, but they are good triggers or reminders for things that happen. Is this all are we connecting some dots here where this all aligns, or am I missing the point?
No. Yeah. I'll give an example.
Awesome.
So for me personally, I've always found a ton of value in kind of planning and plotting my day.
Sure.
And, I'm constantly advertised to by, these habit journals of sorts, and they tend to be, structured. They ask questions, right? Like, hey, what are the top 3 things you need to do? What are you thankful for, et cetera? And I think I've bought like 4 or 5 of those things. And, I'd start for 1-2 days and then I'd stop. And the issue for me was not that I didn't find value in doing that, because it certainly helped. But the issue is that I just wouldn't remember to do it. My brain is thinking about, a bunch of different things. And that's really kind of why I started doing it digitally, because computers don't forget things, or at least they shouldn't, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
If I program a computer to tell me to do something at 9 a.m., well, it's going to do that on repeat.
Yep.
And so I see that as an example where computers complementing humans, it makes zero sense in my mind for why a manager or why a team leader should bug people manually for updates every week. My brother is an engineer, very, he does quite well for himself. And every week he is tasked with filling out a status update that is shared, with the technical organization. And he'll manually ask people for updates over Slack. And it's like, that is a potential bottleneck. If he forgets to even ask one person, then the quality and the information flow will not be as good. And so the question for me is, well, how do you get, technology to really complement the people doing the work? And I think reminders and the triggers is a perfect example of where computers can just be so much better.
Yeah. Well, and where that kind of transitions the discussion into this future of work idea.
Sure.
Yeah. And there's the doom and gloom view of the computers are going to take over the world and we're going to have a bunch of people who won't have any work to do. And that's another one of those patterns that repeats itself. And there are a number of these that are out there where if you look back at, there's a picture of, I think it's in a bus where everybody on the bus is reading the newspaper. And they draw the correlation between that and everybody looking at their phone. I forget if it was Plato or Socrates who said that books were going to be the undoing of mankind because of the impact on communication and thought and conversation. So we have these things that have existed in the past. How can people think differently about the way that computers or technology can augment the work that we do and actually accelerate behavior? And this goes beyond the triggers that you were just talking about. But what are some of the other things that come to mind when you think of this challenge?
Gosh, it's a tough question. Clearly work is changing. I do not have a lot of insight in, I haven't thought too much about, to what extent computers will take over, if at all.
Yeah.
Maybe most of the jobs have already been taken over and we just haven't, it's been a more gradual shift. The one thing I do think about, and I don't know if this is what you're looking for, I think a lot about how human nature changes in regards to the tools and to the technology, right? So I'll give an example. There have been studies that there's been a ton of research done on this broad topic called computer-mediated communication. And, you clearly see examples of the downsides of electronic communication. If you were to go on Facebook, for example, you might see, conversation quickly go south. Twitter, that's probably even more prevalent.
Sure.
But when people are behind a screen, they tend to say things that they would not say in person, right? If I was face to face with you, I would behave and say very different things than if we interacted on Twitter, most likely. another example, like there's just this amazing research out there that I'll give a couple other examples. One is, Slack and other tools extensively use emojis. And I was kind of like, this emoji thing is kind of dumb in the early days. But then I read the study where it talks about how people, when they see an emoji, they process it like a facial reaction. Like if you made a face,
yep,
I would process it in a very similar way to how I process you leaving a reaction emoji on Slack, for example.
Huh, interesting.
Like that's super interesting. Here's another example that I find kind of really interesting, and especially how it ties into what I'm doing some. But they did research, I don't know how many years ago it was, but essentially they found that with teenagers, a mixture of in-person communication and texting, I believe the report was on, enabled the individuals to accelerate their relationship building because they would disclose information over text that they may not disclose in person. But if you complement it with the in-person communication, then you can accelerate it. And when I read that, I was like, wow, this makes a lot of sense because, people using Friday, you're filling out a somewhat structured update where there's questions. Right. And people would always say, hey, the feedback that I'm getting in this tool is, for some people, it's way better than the stuff that I get in person. It's like, that's weird. And the reality is when people have a little bit of time to compose a message, think it through, be a little bit more reflective, they end up oftentimes giving you better insight. And so if you're a leader or if you're responsible for managing a team or even understanding what people are working on, I think using, essentially answering questions behind a screen, you end up getting better data that can help you make better decisions. I think that's just a fascinating example of how humans and computers work together in some capacity, and how I would argue it's incredibly important that, the future of work, the people, working in the future understand these principles that undergird the majority of their communication. I would argue you need to understand the difference and the benefits of an in-person conversation versus a conversation, over Slack. And you need to know when to switch between them, right? So I'm going on a tangent, but there was one time I had an old boss and, this was for a distributed team, and he gave pretty honest and blunt feedback over email. And there were about 100 different ways that I could take that feedback. When in reality, when delivering the type of feedback that he was giving, he probably should have done it over, a Zoom call or over over the phone at minimum, right? Because then I have more data points that I can process.
Yep.
But when it's done over text, it can be very easily misinterpreted. And so that's an example of something I really am fascinated by is, the future of work and especially how our communication channels need to adapt and how we need to be thoughtful, almost like emotional intelligence. But instead of that, it's like you need to be intelligent about the way that you choose your communication channels and how it's almost like there's a fit that needs to happen. And if you deliver the wrong thing over the right thing on the wrong channel, it might not be, it may not work as well. Yeah. Right. Well, so it's about finding the fit.
Yeah. Well, and it applies in so many of these different things that we're talking about. And again, I get that the arc here is related to communication. So even these tools, like figuring out when do I use email versus Google Docs or versus Teams or Slack or Asana or Trello. When do I apply the right tool inside the organization to deliver the thing that I'm trying to deliver? And how does, and this is where the thinking process comes in and the iteration and the testing, how do those tools change or shift depending on the makeup of my team? And how do those tools and approach and methods change and shift depending on the individual that I'm talking to? Like, I know that there are some times when I'm ready to send a text to Jen, who's my wife. I think twice, how might that one be received? And is it better to pick up the phone and call or wait until I'm home? The other thing that we can do is we can use things like GIFs, and we don't need to get into a GIF debate. But I guess now I have to ask you the question. So is it a GIF or is it a GIF?
I think it's a GIF.
Okay, good. So
I always, whenever I say it, I always accidentally swap to the one that I don't want to use.
That's awesome. So, yeah, but you think of these GIFs, and there are common ones that I use, and just use them over and over again. It becomes a great way to deliver a point with some level of emotion that goes beyond the text and helps remove some ambiguity around interpretation. And so now I kind of wonder if, as leaders, as people who are leading folks inside an organization, or responsible for a team, or leading an entire organization, or even leading our customers, or leading our families, however that works, when you're in a position of leadership or position of influence, it seems like it's becoming more and more important to be thoughtful about how you apply a given tool or approach to a scenario. And we really have to become craftsmen, so to speak, in the way that we think about using these tools, in the way that someone might do woodworking, and realize that, hey, I should not, and this will demonstrate the amount of woodworking that I do or stuff around the house, but it is often that I will use the back end of a screwdriver as a hammer to nail things in. And there are many times I've caught my hand on the nail doing that, when I could have just spent the extra 30 or 60 seconds, walked into the garage and actually grabbed the right tool for the job. What does that make you think about?
Yeah, actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because there's a super, super helpful framework that I think really, it's not perfect, but I think it completely changed how I think about what channels to use. And it's called media richness theory.
Okay.
It was written, I believe, either in the early 90s or the late 80s. And the authors essentially, posit a theory where, and I'm trying to remember the exact names that they give, but essentially there's two variables you need to care about. The first is, what is the level of ambiguity? They have a special name for it, but what is the level of ambiguity? And also, what is the potential that you might be misunderstood? And if those are high, then you need to pursue and use the richest communication channel you can. And that is in person. Because if I'm sitting in front of you, I can read your facial reactions. I can read your body language. There's tone. There's all these data points that I'm able to process. If the inverse is true, if, it's relatively, cut and dry information, and if you and I, let's say, have a decent relationship, well, then maybe it's okay to use a channel or a medium in which the data is doesn't have a lot of richness. Text is essentially that. And so how I think about it is, I really think that's a super helpful framework, because how you might apply that to a workplace is, if I'm having a one-on-one with my boss, that should be as rich of a channel or as rich of a medium as possible. But if I'm sharing a status update, if I'm just doing basic information sharing, well, maybe that's best done behind text. I really think the media richness theory is I think every knowledge worker should know that, especially if you work with people in another location. I think it's such a critical, mental model for thinking about the channel in which you communicate. Yeah,
I can tell you the number of mistakes that I've made, because actually, I probably should say I can't even count the number of mistakes that I've made because of the wrong thing that I'm trying to communicate, and then the backlash that has happened as a result. Because I tend to be pretty direct. Like if you're following me on Twitter, or you engage in conversations, you realize this is it. I kind of am what I am. The problem is when there are folks who have not experienced enough of that to understand the intention behind it. And where things really get ugly for me personally is when I'm around a group long enough that I feel much more comfortable in being direct. Mm-hmm. And Luke, I know you know all of this stuff because of some of the stuff that we did back when you were over at Crystal Nose and Disc, and how we played around with that. And I mean, it's awesome to understand kind of how do people operate in higher stress environments and be cognizant of things. The piece that I want to build on, though, here is the idea of using models and framework to help with decision making. Luke, one of the things, it's interesting to hear you talk about the mental models and framework. That is something I'm spending a lot of time drawing out as I try to simplify communication and process as it relates to helping people, whether they're customers of mine from a Catalyst sale perspective or just people I know in general, demystify or simplify sales. So there are a couple of key models that I'll use, ones that are are relatively timeless, like traditional 2x2 or an Eisenhower box or a Franklin T. Or you go through and you talk about the media readiness theory and application there. Or you talk about the habit framework from a BJ Fogg. Why do frameworks resonate, and what's the risk of getting too married or committed to a given framework?
This is a tough question. I don't know how to respond again.
Well, awesome. So you study these frameworks and these principles and these ideas, and you start to look at them, and you've adopted different mental models. What is it? Why do you adopt something that maybe BJ Fogg says versus what's the book of the day around habits? I think it's Atomic Habits.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. Quite frankly, I have a very bad memory, and so typically the ones that I remember are the easy ones.
Awesome.
And so the danger is, so the beauty of a model is that, especially if it's simple, is that you can remember it, and in theory you are more likely to apply it in a given scenario. The downside, sometimes it won't fully encapsulate the range, or like there'll be edge cases, right, that the model may not account for. But the way I think about a lot of things in life is if you're 80% there, you're good.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so that's where I think the notion of a model is helpful, is because it gets me 75, 80% of the way there. I can remember it, great, because I can't remember a lot of things. And so there we go. That's why I use them.
And it's the same thing. And I would put me in that same category. Like there was a time where my memory was really good, like names and places and people and all of those kind of things. And for whatever reason, it seems like that's starting to blur. And I don't know if that blur is because of lack of sleep, because of having a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old in the house, or because of any number of reasons. But as we go through these things, these frameworks, these models can help get us, like Luke was talking about, get us about 80% of the way there. And then we can apply thinking, again, getting back into that idea of critical thinking, creative thinking. We can apply thought to the challenges that we're operating in. And then I believe my view on the model stuff is that once we start applying that thought and we start taking action, then we have something that we can use as a bit of a litmus test to determine, did this work out the way that I expected it to, or it should have? And then it gets back into that habit that you were talking about a little bit earlier when we started the conversation, which is reflection. And so do you have a reflection practice that you go through where you either reflect on data, or you reflect on information, or you reflect on experience? Is that something that's important to you?
Yeah, so I try to do a daily one in the morning. So I'm currently experimenting with if I should do this at the end of the day or the beginning of the day. But the idea is, it's pretty simple. I currently am asking myself 3 questions, although I may change it up. So typically this runs in the morning, and I say, the questions are, what are the top 3 things you need to accomplish today? The second is, how did yesterday go? And then the third is, what did you learn over the past 24 hours? And it's shocking. I was filling out the one this morning on what did I learn? Yep. And I had to sit there for a few minutes, and I was like, what did I actually learn yesterday? And just going through that process, it was just kind of eye-opening, because it's so easy to go through life on autopilot.
Yep.
But when you create these like stopping points, it helps you really evaluate things. And so I find immense amount of value in doing that for myself. At a team level, we do, daily stand-ups. Yep. Which I think are, and clearly this is all done asynchronously. So we don't actually have a meeting to do that. And then typically at the end of the week, I'll do some type of weekly recap. I'm thinking about doing some type of monthly higher level goal setting or planning.
Yep.
But I'm just trying to keep it simple for now and establish better habits. Like I said, I'm building what I'm building because I need it.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a bit about where people can find out more and how people can follow you, and where, if they're interested in testing or checking out Friday, where should folks go?
Yeah, sure. So you can try the product and use it for free at friday.app, .app instead of .com. And if you want to talk to me, you could shoot me an email, luke@friday.app, or you can follow me on Twitter at LukeThomas14. Yeah, those are the best ways to reach me. But I love talking about this stuff. I'd love to learn more if people have thoughts and and feedback, but hopefully it was a useful conversation.
Definitely. And I'd love to have you back on as you start to get more data in the tool and you start to identify more and more of those patterns, and you can share some additional stories around business impact. So we'll have you on as a future guest. Thank you, Luke.
Sounds good, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Please check out the work that Luke is working on at Friday and the product he and the team are building. We will include all of the links in the show notes. If you know of someone who will benefit from hearing this discussion, please share it with them and let us know via Twitter or LinkedIn. I'd like to hear how you're applying the lessons learned and concepts discussed in your role today. Sales is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about yours?